Most people who met Staff Sergeant Daniel Reyes after his discharge wouldn't have guessed he was a Marine. With his laid-back demeanor, scruffy beard, and worn flannel shirts, he looked more like a construction foreman than a combat veteran. But one day, a curious coworker named Charlie spotted the faded military tattoo on his arm and started asking questions. Reyes, normally private about his past, didn't mind sharing a few lighthearted stories. Mishaps from boot camp jokes from Camp Pendleton, but eventually the conversation turned serious. Charlie asked if Reyes had ever been in a firefight. Reyes nodded and mentioned his deployment to Iraq in 2004, specifically in Fallujah. Then came the inevitable follow-up. Was it scary to Charlie? It was just a question. To Reyes, it opened a door he rarely walked through. Fear in combat, he explained, wasn't always what people imagined. There was fear, yes, but what stuck with him wasn't just bullets flying or explosions. The single most terrifying moment he ever experienced in uniform was something far less conventional. Something that still didn't make sense. Something that felt inhuman. Fallujah wasn't just another dot on the map, it was a nightmare carved in concrete and rebar. After the initial push into the city turned into a bloodbath, American forces pulled back and regrouped. Months later, they returned with a vengeance, and Daniel Reyes was part of that second wave. His unit was assigned to the Al-Majid district, a tangle of narrow alleyways and crumbling homes perfect for ambushes. It wasn't like the skirmishes in southern Iraq or the insurgent hit-and-runs near Baghdad. Fallujah was different. The enemy here wasn't just local militias or former army loyalists hiding in the shadows. These were foreign fighters, hardcore jihadists from Chechnya, Syria, even North Africa. Reyes described it as fighting the international all-stars of terrorism. Trained, determined, and high on something he couldn't quite put into words back then. Urban combat became a twisted game of chess, each building a deadly square on the board, each move requiring sacrifice. Reyes had been in shootouts before, but Al-Majid felt like a pressure cooker. There was something unnatural about it. The silence between gunfire, the way shadows moved where no one stood. And then there was the house, the one that would change everything he thought he knew about fear. The house sat behind a high concrete wall, scarred by a single blast hole wide enough for a man to crawl through. Recon had flagged it as suspicious, no movement inside, no heat signatures, but the kind of fortified layout that screamed trouble. It was late afternoon when Reyes and his three-man fire team received orders to clear it. With him were Corporal Malik Jones, their saw gunner, Lance Corporal Theo Nguyen, the team's radio man and sharp-eyed scout, and Private First Class Jaden Moore, the newest and youngest of them. The four of them moved in, carefully hugging walls and keeping low as they approached the breach. Reyes was first through the hole, landing in the small courtyard beyond his boots, crunching softly on dust and gravel. They stacked up on the nearest door, weapons raised, nerves tight. Inside, someone was yelling an Arabic name, shouted again and again. Mustafa, Mustafa. The voice sounded panicked, confused. That was enough to push Reyes into action. They kicked the door in and found a man in the hallway, rifle in hand, frozen mid-step, with a look of sheer disbelief. Before he could react, Malik lit him up with a tight burst, 15 rounds stitched across his chest and stomach. The man crumpled instantly dead where he stood. Reyes and two others cleared the lower level, while Theo secured the upstairs. It was supposed to be a routine sweep, another dusty house, in a city full of them. Reyes was left by a front window watching the breach in the wall for any stragglers. For a few minutes, all was quiet, just the sound of their own breath and the distant thump of gunfire blocks away. Then everything changed. A few minutes after the dust settled, Theo shouted down from the second floor, asking Reyes to grab the dead man's phone intel, like that could be invaluable. Reyes gave a quick nod and stepped out from his watchpost by the window. He walked back through the hallway where the body had fallen, but the body wasn't there. Just a wide, sticky pool of blood staining the cracked tiles. No sign of the man, no dragging trail, no scuff marks. Nothing. just a few faint drops leading away into a darkened room near the back of the house. Reyes froze. Every instinct screamed that something wasn't right. The hallway was clear. The ground floor had already been swept. "So where the hell did the body go?" he called out to the others, voice tight. "Body's gone." Confused chatter crackled over the radio. Malik and Jaden came back downstairs, weapons raised eyes, scanning every shadow. Reyes pointed toward the back room. The blood trail led there, small broken droplets, almost hesitant, like something had staggered instead of crawled. They moved slowly, the silence suffocating. No noise from the other side of the door, no movement. Just the kind of wrong that made the hairs on Reyes' arms stand up. They decided to toss a grenade in standard procedure for a potential ambush. As the pin was pulled and the grenade arced into the dark, Reyes had a fleeting, irrational thought he couldn't shake. What if this isn't war anymore? What if it's something else entirely? His Amori was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. On December 23, 1948, he was hanged alongside 5 other top officials. Other perpetrators met similar fates. Lieutenant General Kaito Tani, who oversaw mass executions outside the city, was executed by firing squad in April 1947. The infamous sword duelists, Second Lieutenants Muraoka and Noda, whose beheading contest had shocked even Japanese civilians, were extradited to China, tried and publicly executed in January 1948. Yet, not all those responsible faced justice. Prince Yorihiko Ayama, a member of the imperial family, who had personally authorized the no prisoners order at Jinling, was granted full immunity by the American occupation authorities. Some officers committed seppuku ritual suicide before they could be arrested. Others faded quietly into civilian life, never speaking of what they had done. For the survivors, the trials were a bitter mix of relief and frustration. Some justice had been served, yes, but so much had been lost. And for many in the West, the horrors of Jinling remained a footnote overshadowed by the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But for the Chinese people, and for anyone who believes history must be remembered to avoid repeating it, Jinling remains a wound that still pulses with memory. Jinling may have burned nearly a century ago, but its shadows still stretch into the present. Beneath the silence of forgotten graves and the pages of redacted textbooks lies a truth too important to ignore. The massacre was not just a moment of cruelty. It was a reckoning with what happens when ideology drowns out empathy and silence replaces accountability. To remember Jinling is not merely to mourn the dead. It is to honor them with truth, to stand guard against forgetting, and to remind ourselves that history left unchallenged has a way of repeating itself. Hey friends, if this story moved, made you think, or taught you something new, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with others who care about the hidden corners of history. Every click helps us bring more untold stories to light, stories that matter, stories that deserve to be remembered. Your support keeps these voices alive. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you in the next one. The explosion rocked the back of the house, sending up a cloud of dust and debris. Reyes raised his rifle, expecting screams. Maybe a secondary explosion. Anything normal. Instead, there was only silence. And then footsteps. Heavy boots pounding against concrete. From the haze burst a figure sprinting straight at them with a blade raised high. It was the same man they'd just shot, same clothes, same blood-soaked chest. But this time his eyes were wide and glassy, stretched so far open they barely looked human, and he didn't make a sound. No battle cry, no Arabic chant, no words, just that awful dead silence and the gleam of steel catching what little light came through the busted windows. Reyes stumbled backward, heart thudding in his ears. "Shoot him in the head," he shouted over and over. Jaden opened fire 2-3 rounds slamming into the man's torso, but he kept coming. Even with holes tearing through him, the attacker didn't falter. He didn't scream, didn't blink, didn't bleed like a man should. Malik tried to flank, but nearly caught the knife himself. The air felt thick, unreal, like time was moving wrong. Finally, Theo dropped to one knee and lined up the shot close-range barrel tilted up beneath the man's chin. 3 rounds, quick and final. Boom, boom, boom. The man's head came apart like wet plaster, and only then did his body stop moving. He collapsed in a heap, blood mixing with dust knife still clutched in one rigid hand. The room was dead silent, all 4 Marines frozen in place. Reyes stood there breathing hard, his mind spinning in 1,000 directions. They had killed this man, he'd seen it. Watched him drop lifeless in that hallway. What had just attacked them wasn't natural. It wasn't adrenaline or bravery. It was something different. Something that didn't care about dying. Something that looked like a man, but wasn't. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the fight itself. Reyes could still hear the echo of the last 3 shots ringing in his head as he stared at what was left of the attacker. Jaden was pale, breathing in shallow gulps. Malik kept his weapon trained on the body, just in case. No one moved for several seconds. Finally, Reyes stepped forward and used his boot to nudge the man's arm. No twitch, no breath. Just a limp corpse, finally still. It took another minute before anyone spoke. Theo muttered. That wasn't normal, and no one disagreed. After securing the rest of the house, they radioed in the contact report and waited for reinforcements to sweep the area. None of them mentioned what had really happened in that room over the comms. Not the way the man had moved, not the way he didn't go down. They just said engaged, one hostile neutralized. Reyes found himself staring at the ruined face again, wondering how much of what he'd just seen was real and how much his mind had twisted under pressure. But the knife was still there, and so was the blood. Too much to forget. When the follow-up unit arrived, they began a full sweep of the house and gathered what they could for intel. What Reyes and his team found in the back room sent another chill down their spines. Scattered across a filthy mattress and a cracked desk were empty syringes, broken glass vials, and half-labeled containers of injectable adrenaline and amphetamines, enough to keep a man wired beyond reason. This wasn't some last-ditch suicide charge. The enemy had been preparing for something like this, turning their own fighters into monsters who could take a dozen bullets and keep going. Reyes had heard rumors about drugged-up insurgents, but this was the first time he'd seen the result up close. It explained the attacker's inhuman strength and total lack of fear. But it didn't explain the eyes or the silence or the way reality itself had seemed to bend when that man came charging out of the smoke. Reyes said nothing to the others. He just helped bag the evidence, wiped his hands clean, and walked out into the fading daylight, haunted, not just by what he'd seen, but by how close it had felt to something unnatural. The summer of 1914 in the quiet town of Shrewsfield felt charged like the air before a thunderstorm. Young men like Arthur Langley and his friends buzzed with excitement, caught up in the patriotic fever sweeping England. War seemed distant, even romantic. No one understood what was truly coming, but for now it felt like the beginning of a grand adventure. That electric summer quickly turned into a spark of action when the news broke Britain was at war. In the dim, smoky corners of the Crown and Thistle pub, Arthur Langley and his friends, Tom Radcliffe, Harold Penn, and Edwin Clark, made a decision they believed was noble, even thrilling. Inspired by speeches and posters promising glory, they agreed to enlist together. The idea of a pals battalion serving side by side with childhood friends felt reassuring. There was a strange comfort in imagining war not as chaos, but as camaraderie wrapped in khaki. With their names freshly inked on the enlistment list, they laughed and toasted, unaware that they were stepping into history and hell hand in hand. Training began just weeks later, and though it was grueling, Arthur and his friends found humor in the hardship. Mud-caked boots, blistered hands and barked commands became part of daily life. Yet the presence of familiar faces made it all bearable, even fun at times. Between drills, they cracked jokes, sang off-key marching songs, and shared dreams of returning home as heroes. Beneath the laughter, however, a quiet unease lingered. They were preparing for something none of them truly understood. Still, the promise of sticking together gave them courage, and the illusion that friendship could somehow shield them from what lay ahead. By early autumn, orders came in. Their unit was headed to the front. As the train waited at the platform, nearly the entire town turned out to see them off. Mothers wept quietly, fathers gripped hands a little too firmly, and children waved homemade flags. Arthur noticed his mother's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The brass band played something cheerful, but it felt hollow. As the train pulled away, the boys still laughed and waved, holding on to that final flicker of innocence. Somewhere deep down, though, Arthur felt a strange tug of dread he couldn't quite explain. Belgium greeted them not with glory, but with gray skies, endless rain and mud that swallowed their boots whole. The trenches near Ypres were cold, wet, and crawling with rats the size of small dogs. The booming of artillery rarely stopped echoing day and night like distant thunder. Days bled into nights, and boredom became as oppressive as fear. The food was bland, the lice relentless, and the smell a mix of damp earth, gunpowder, and unwashed bodies clung to everything. Arthur and his friends clung to routine and humor to stay sane, but cracks had started to show. They'd expected action, maybe heroism, not this slow grind of decay and waiting. Rumors of gas weapons floated through the ranks, but few believed them. The enemy, they assumed, wouldn't stoop to such inhuman things. They were wrong. It was a late afternoon in April when the sky changed. What began as another dreary day in the trenches near Ypres turned sinister with a strange, acrid smell, like rotten eggs soaked in bleach. Arthur looked up just in time to see a yellowish haze creeping across the no-man's land. Then came the scream. Gas! 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 Everything erupted into chaos. Men fumbled for their masks, some shouting, others already coughing. Arthur managed to pull his on, though he'd already inhaled a breath or two, and it burned like fire down his throat. Around him, the scene was pure terror. Some men ran blindly into the fog, eyes watering, mouths wide open in silent screams. Others collapsed where they stood. Arthur saw Tom Radcliffe struggling with his mask, trembling fingers, unable to fasten the straps. A moment later, Tom was on the ground, gasping like a fish out of water foam, gathering at the corners of his mouth. The gas was thick, so thick, it seemed to blur reality. It stung the skin, burned the eyes, and smothered every sound except coughing and crying. They were told to stay low. Gas hugged the earth, but that meant lying beside the dying. Arthur pressed himself into the mud, heart pounding, barely breathing. The attack felt endless. By the time the yellow mist lifted, dozens were dead or dying, and the trench had become a vision of hell. When the gas finally drifted away, the silence that followed was even more haunting. Groans echoed through the trench, wet, rattling sounds from lungs filled with poison. Arthur peeled off his mask, but the stench still clung to the air, as if the gas had soaked into the earth itself. That night, no one slept. Every cough sent ripples of panic. Men lay with their masks in hand, too afraid to close their eyes. Even the wind seemed menacing, as though it might bring the gas back without warning. Arthur sat in the corner of their dugout, knees pulled tight to his chest, watching over what was left of his friends. Some cried quietly, others stared blankly, numb. He hadn't seen Harold or Edwin since the attack began. Tom was gone. That truth hadn't fully settled yet, but the image of his friend's face, twisted in agony, was burned into Arthur's mind. And deep down, they all knew this wasn't the last time the gas would come. The next morning, they buried the dead in a shallow trench behind the line. There were no chaplains, no eulogies, just mud silence and the dull thud of dirt falling on uniforms. Arthur helped carry Tom's body, still wearing the half-secured mask that hadn't saved him. He didn't cry. None of them did. They were too drained, too hollow. Arthur whispered a prayer as they covered Tom's face, not just for his friend, but for everyone still breathing in that poisoned world. The war had taken Tom, and with him a piece of Arthur that wouldn't return. In the weeks that followed, Arthur was no longer the same. His lungs ached constantly, each breath a reminder of what he'd survived. He coughed through the night, often waking in panic, convinced the gas had returned. Some men, though they'd lived through the attack, began to wither, skin-blistered eyes, clouded bodies failing slowly. Arthur saw it in Edwin, too, who'd reappeared days later, quiet and distant, his voice reduced to a wheeze. They were all shadows of the boys who had once laughed through drills. The war had scarred them, not just in body, but in ways no medic could treat. Arthur still wore his mask at night, not out of regulation, but from a fear that no longer listened to reason. Years later, long after the guns had gone quiet, Arthur returned to Shrewsfield, but he never truly came home. He moved slowly, spoke little, and carried a cough that never quite left him. Neighbors called him the quiet one, unaware of the ghosts he lived with. He never married, never spoke of the war, except in one letter written near the end of his life. In it, he told of Tom the gas, and the day everything changed. True peace, he wrote, will only come when I'm as still as he is. It wasn't bitterness, but acceptance. The war had claimed his past, and now he was simply waiting for the silence to catch up. The city of Elven used to be full of life, but now it's sealed off by war. Explosions echo day and night, and winter winds slip through shattered windows. The streets are empty. The air carries fear, and survival has become the only routine. Life here isn't lived. It's endured one cold, uncertain day at a time. Inside a crumbling apartment building on Elven's east side lives the Murad family. 13-year-old Layla keeps a journal by candlelight, documenting the chaos. Her younger brother Sammy, just 9, still asks innocent questions no one can answer. Their mother Yasmin, once cheerful, now barely speaks. Their father Adil repairs what he can and scavenges for food. Even their cat Noura, rescued from under the stairs, seems to understand the silence of war. Together they form a fragile unit, clinging to one another as the world outside collapses inch by inch into smoke and snow. Life inside the Murad's apartment has become a delicate ritual of survival. After the windows shattered from a nearby blast, Adil taped up the frames with plastic and old blankets, but the cold still seeps in. Everyone wears coats indoors. They sleep huddled together in the warmest room, taking turns stoking a makeshift heater with scavenged scraps. Food is scarce, so Layla and Adil built a small planter box on the balcony where a few stubborn carrots and onions grow in reused cooking pots. When aid drops come, if they come, they risk sniper fire just to reach the trucks. Water is harder. The taps have been dry for months, and trips to the nearest well mean braving open streets. School hasn't truly existed in over a year, but a former teacher gathers neighborhood kids in the basement each morning. By the dim glow of candles, they read stories and solve math problems on scraps of paper. In this frozen, shattered corner of Elven, even the smallest routines feel like quiet acts of defiance. One morning, Rami, Layla's 17-year-old brother, left quietly with 2 empty jugs, determined to reach the well before the next round of shelling. He never returned. Word spread later that a sniper had been seen near the old square, and someone matching Rami's build had been shot. Layla's father searched until nightfall, but found only 1 jug lying in the street. Their mother Yasmin stopped speaking altogether. She now stares for hours at the apartment wall, her grief etched in silence. Rami had been their protector, the one who used to joke to carry water to dream beyond the war. Without him, the apartment feels colder, quieter. Layla avoids looking at his empty mattress in the corner. Even Sammy doesn't ask where he is anymore. In a place where loss is common, this one felt final, too sharp, too cruel. The war had taken more than a son. It had stolen the warmth that once filled their home. Since Rami's death, the family has grown hypersensitive to every sound. They've learned to read the war through silence, the kind that hangs just before a bomb drops. When things go quiet, they stop breathing, eyes darting toward the ceiling. Footsteps in the hallway can send them scrambling to the safest corner of the apartment, a windowless pantry padded with blankets. In Elven, fear isn't loud anymore. It whispers, waits, and teaches even children to listen like soldiers. One morning, for the first time in weeks, the city was still not the tense silence before a strike, but something gentler. Adil whispered that it might be safe, and within minutes, he and Layla were out the door with empty buckets. They sprinted through alleyways, reached the well, and filled up, hearts pounding the entire time. That night, the Maraud's drank slowly, treating each sip like it was a rare treasure. Sammy made everyone laugh by pretending to be a wine connoisseur. Even Yasmin cracked a smile. Later, Nora curled up beside Layla, purring, as the girl scribbled the day's victory into her journal. In a life defined by loss, these fleeting moments of peace felt like rebellion, a reminder that joy still lived here, however briefly. That night, by the faint light of a stubby candle, Layla wrote everything down: the quiet morning, the water run, Sammy's joke, and her mother's rare smile. Her notebook, tattered and stained, had become more than a diary. It was her proof that life still flickered in the darkness. She wrote not just to remember, but to resist, to ensure that their voices wouldn't vanish beneath rubble and silence. In a world where everything could be taken, words were the one thing she could still claim as her own. Each morning, Layla opens her eyes and listens, first for silence, then for breath. The siege continues, yet so does her writing, her family's warmth, and their will to endure. In a city buried beneath ash and fear, the Maraud's survive one fragile day at a time, and with each word Layla pens, she refuses to let their story disappear. As snow begins to fall again over Elven, Layla presses her pencil to the last page of her notebook. Outside the city remains wounded quiet, but not at peace. Inside, her family gathers close, wrapped in layers of blankets and memory. She doesn't know what tomorrow will bring, but for tonight, they are still here, and that, she writes, is enough. When most Americans think of World War II's beginning, they picture Adolf Hitler's troops storming across Poland's borders on September 1st, 1939. That date is etched into textbooks, documentaries, and public memory as the start of the bloodiest conflict in modern history. But what if the war didn't begin in Europe at all? What if it actually started nearly a decade earlier and half a world away? In the fall of 1931, far from the forests of Germany or the trenches of France, a different kind of storm was brewing in East Asia. On a cool September evening, deep in the contested territories of northeast China, a low-ranking Japanese officer lit the fuse, literally and figuratively, that would ignite a brutal and unrelenting war. For decades, Japan had been inching toward militarism and territorial expansion. But what happened that night along the South Manchuria Railway changed everything. That single act of sabotage launched a chain reaction that would eventually lead to the massacre of hundreds of thousands, the deaths of millions, and a long-delayed reckoning with imperial brutality. While most of the world watched Europe, a quieter, equally catastrophic front had already opened in the East. In this series, we'll pull back the curtain on the Pacific War's shadowy prologue, where ambition, ideology, and a thirst for empire collided in horrifying ways. If you thought you knew when World War II began, prepare to reconsider everything. The road to Nanking was already paved with blood long before Pearl Harbor ever made the news. To understand how Japan arrived at that explosive moment in 1931, we need to step back further. Centuries back to when the island nation was still ruled under the rigid hand of the Kurotani shogunate. This feudal military regime, locked in traditions older than the printing press, kept the country isolated from the outside world through a strict closed country policy known as sokoku. Foreign trade was nearly banned. Christianity was ruthlessly suppressed, and the ruling elite, especially the warrior class of samurai, were perched high atop a social hierarchy known as shinokosho. Japan became a kind of living museum, beautiful, culturally rich, but economically stagnant and vulnerable beneath the surface. By the mid-1800s, cracks had begun to show. Food shortages plagued the countryside, and angry peasants began taking to the streets. Western powers, armed with steamships and cannons, started knocking, then demanding their way in. The shock of seeing their closed-off empire outgunned and outclassed pushed Japan to a boiling point. In 1868, that point erupted. The shogunate collapsed, and a young emperor named Enshiro was restored to power in what would become known as the Enmei Restoration. But this wasn't a return to the past. It was a high-speed leap into the modern world. Suddenly, Japan was electrifying itself literally and figuratively. Railroads crisscrossed the islands. Telegraph lines sang with signals. Silk factories buzzed with new machinery. Steam-powered ships took to the seas, and banks sprang up overnight. Japan wasn't just modernizing, it was playing catch-up with the West at breakneck speed. The government modeled its navy after Britain's, its legal system after Germany's, and its industrial base after the United States. The transformation was breathtaking. In less than 4 decades, Japan had reshaped itself from a feudal backwater into a formidable industrial power. But progress came with ambition. Economic growth fueled national pride and also a deep hunger for resources. Japan's volcanic homeland had little in the way of coal oil or farmland. Its solution: expand. Like a pressure cooker with no vent, modernization built up steam behind a tightly sealed lid of tradition and national identity. And the military, brimming with the spirit of the ancient warrior code, now wrapped in steel and smokestacks, was more than willing to lead the charge. The stage was now set. What began as a cultural revival had quietly planted the seeds of conquest. And as the world admired Japan's rapid transformation, few realized that a new kind of empire was already stirring, one forged not by emperors in palaces, but by generals in shadows. By the early 20th century, Japan's transformation from an isolated archipelago into an industrial force was undeniable, but now it wanted proof of its place among the world's great powers. That proof came not in trade agreements or diplomatic fanfare, but in the form of war. In 1904, tensions between Japan and Imperial Russia finally boiled over. At stake was dominance over the Korean peninsula and access to resource-rich Manchuria. Russia, confident in its massive army and imposing navy, saw Japan as little more than an ambitious upstart. But Japan had spent decades preparing for this moment. It had studied, trained, and armed itself for a showdown, and it struck first. Under the command of Admiral Masataka Inoue, the Japanese Navy launched a surprise assault on Russia's Pacific Fleet near the port city of Dalian in modern-day China. The attack stunned the world and crippled Russia's naval presence in the region. But Japan didn't stop there. Victory after victory followed on both land and sea, including the pivotal Battle of Tsushima, where the Russian Baltic Fleet, having sailed over 20,000 miles to assist, was decisively crushed. Japan had done the unthinkable. It defeated a major European empire in full-scale war. The implications were seismic. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power had humbled a Western empire through sheer military might. This wasn't just a win for Japan, it was a message to the world. Japan demanded respect, and for a time, it got it. The Treaty of Koriyama, brokered by American and British diplomats, handed Japan significant territorial gains in Manchuria and recognized its influence over Korea. On the surface, Japan emerged triumphant. But beneath that surface, something dangerous was beginning to stir. Many Japanese nationalists believed that victory proved their divine destiny, Tenko no Michi, to lead Asia and cast off Western dominance. The war had fed a rising belief that Japan's strength didn't just come from modern machines, but from its spirit, its unity, and its righteous cause. It was a heady mix of pride and prophecy, and when the same Western allies who praised Japan's war effort later denied it equal treatment after World War I, resentment grew like wildfire. Japan had tasted victory. Now it wanted more. What began as a push for recognition would soon morph into a ruthless pursuit of domination. And that hunger was far from satisfied. Fresh off its triumph over Russia, Japan entered the 1910s with its chest puffed and eyes set on expansion. It sided with the United Kingdom during World War I, seizing German colonial holdings in China and the Pacific. Japanese warships helped patrol Allied shipping lanes, and its troops ousted German soldiers from Chinese ports, like Qingdao. Yet when the dust of war settled in 1918, Japan's reward felt more like a reprimand. At the Paris Peace Conference, Japan was denied equal footing with the Western victors. Proposals like a racial equality clause meant to ensure Japan received fair treatment in global affairs were quietly dismissed. And then came the sting of economic betrayal. Protectionist tariffs slammed shut many of the very markets Japan had helped defend. For a proud and newly industrialized nation, it felt like a slap in the face. Still reeling from international humiliation, Japan was struck by catastrophe at home. On September 1, 1923, the Great Akashima earthquake tore through the heart of central Japan. The quake, which reached a magnitude of 7.9, flattened large swaths of Tokyo and Yokohama within minutes. Fires erupted from ruptured gas lines, turning whole neighborhoods into charred ruins. More than 140,000 people perished. The nation's modern facade, its railways, factories, and telegraph wires, lay buried beneath rubble and ash. Decades of progress had been undone in under 5 minutes. What emerged from the devastation wasn't just grief, it was transformation. The civilian government, already weakened by economic struggles and political gridlock, floundered in the aftermath. In that vacuum, the military rose like smoke from the embers. Generals like Haruya Kagemoto began pushing a new doctrine, one built on the ancient code of Shinkaido self-sacrifice, loyalty to the emperor and unquestioned obedience to the state. They didn't just want to rebuild Japan, they wanted to resurrect its warrior soul. The public, battered by natural disaster and disillusioned by broken international promises, listened. Military academies overflowed with eager recruits. School children were taught that Japan's destiny was divinely ordained, its enemies inferior, and its future tied to conquest. As the last fires of the Akashima quake were extinguished, new flames fueled by rage, pride, and a thirst for redemption began to smolder across the islands. Japan was preparing for something far bigger than recovery. It was preparing for a reckoning. The reckoning came in the fall of 1931. Not with a formal declaration of war, but with a low rumble in the night and a lie that would set the entire Pacific ablaze. By this time, Japan's military was no longer just advising the government, it was becoming the government. Civilian leaders who dared to challenge the army's authority often met suspicious deaths or resigned under pressure. The public, still haunted by the trauma of the Great Akashima earthquake and embittered by the West's betrayal after World War I, had turned its faith toward generals who promised strength, pride, and purpose. The most extreme among them believed Japan's survival depended on seizing new territory, and the northeastern Chinese province of Manchuria was the perfect prize. Manchuria was vast, rich in coal iron and farmland, everything Japan's mountainous homeland lacked. Japanese troops were already stationed there under the pretext of guarding their interests along the South Manchuria Railway. But what the military really wanted was an excuse to take the entire region by force. That excuse came on the night of September 18, 1931. In a calculated act of deception, Colonel Senzo Itomaru ordered explosives to be placed near the railway tracks. The blast was small, so small in fact, that it barely damaged the rail line. But Itomaru's message to his superiors was anything but subtle. Chinese saboteurs had attacked Japanese infrastructure, and retaliation was imperative. The response was swift and brutal. Within hours, Japanese artillery pounded Chinese barracks near Shenyang. By dawn, infantry units were already sweeping through the city, engaging in skirmishes with poorly equipped and disorganized Chinese forces. What should have been a localized incident exploded into full-scale occupation. With only 500 Japanese soldiers, Itomaru's forces managed to rout over 7,000 Chinese defenders. The public back home rejoiced. Newspapers hailed the victory. Young boys dreamed of glory in foreign lands. The military had protected the homeland and brought order to chaos. At least that was the story they sold. Back in Tokyo, Prime Minister Minoru Kanzaki was horrified. He knew the military had acted without authorization. He also knew that launching an invasion without government approval violated international agreements and could draw condemnation from the League of Nations. He publicly demanded that the military halt its operations and withdraw from Manchuria. Within a week, he was dead shot point blank by an unknown assailant in what was clearly a political assassination. At that moment, any illusion of civilian control in Japan crumbled. The gears of war had turned, and no one, not even the prime minister, could stop them. What had begun as a manufactured explosion on a quiet railway line had become a runaway train barreling toward bloodshed and empire. Manchuria was only the beginning. What began in Manchuria didn't end there. It only fanned the flames. By the time the international community issued its timid condemnation of Japan's unauthorized invasion, it was far too late. The empire had already dug in, established a puppet government called Manchukuo, and brushed off the League of Nations like a gnat on its sleeve. Japan had tasted victory without consequence, and the world's silence only emboldened its generals. Over the next few years, military influence seeped deeper into every corner of Japanese society. Dissenting politicians were silenced. Journalists who questioned the army's motives disappeared. Even schoolbooks were rewritten to glorify expansion, teach blind obedience to the emperor, and portray war not as a horror, but as a noble duty. By 1937, with Manchuria firmly under its control, Japan turned its gaze southward toward the heart of China. On July 7th, a skirmish broke out at the Marco Bridge near Beijing. It was a minor clash. Confused shots fired between Japanese patrols and Chinese soldiers, but Japan seized on it as justification for a full-scale invasion. This time, there was no pretense of restraint. Troop transports moved by the thousands. Warplanes blackened the skies. And by August, Japanese forces had launched a massive assault on Shanghai, one of China's most populous and modern cities. The Battle of Shanghai was unlike anything Japan had faced before. The Chinese Nationalist Army under General Du Zhenghao fought back with unexpected ferocity. For months, urban warfare raged through the streets block by block, building by building. Japanese commanders expecting a quick victory were stunned at the resistance. As casualties mounted, so did frustration. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died in the narrow alleys of Shanghai. Tanks bogged down. Airstrikes flattened entire neighborhoods, but failed to break Chinese morale. But even as Japanese soldiers struggled through Shanghai's rubble, the high command set its sights on a bigger target. China's political heart, the capital city of Jinling. Located just a few hundred miles west, Jinling represented more than just a strategic objective. It was a symbol. If Japan could break Jinling, it could break China's will to resist. General Yutaro Hisamori, a rising star in the Imperial Army, volunteered to lead the campaign. His forces were battle-hardened, angry, and eager for vengeance after the grueling fight in Shanghai. Opposing him, General Du pledged to defend Jinling to the death with a force of 81,000 men. Yet behind closed doors, the Chinese government had already begun pulling out evacuating officials and abandoning the city's civilian population to its fate. Jinling was on the verge of becoming a battleground, but worse, a trap, a place where two ideologies, one fighting for survival, the other for domination, would collide with unspeakable consequences. And as Hisamori's troops advanced, few could predict just how horrifying the next chapter would become. As General Yutaro Hisamori's divisions closed in on Jinling, the air grew heavy, not just with smoke from burning towns, but with a growing sense of dread. News of the Japanese advance reached the capital ahead of the troops, trailing stories of scorched villages, indiscriminate bombing, and atrocities whispered in panic. Survivors who managed to flee spoke of entire communities burned alive, of mothers and children mowed down in the open. But it wasn't just the speed of the Japanese military that terrified the Chinese, it was how they moved. Calculated, relentless, fueled by rage. After months of brutal house-to-house combat in Shanghai, Hisamori's soldiers had become something else entirely: hardened, humiliated, and hungry for revenge. On December 1st, 1937, Japanese forces began their final push toward Jinling. But they weren't just fighting soldiers, they were hunting symbols. The city represented the heart of the Chinese Republic, and its fall would be both a military and psychological death blow. While General Du Jinghao still commanded 81,000 troops, many were wounded or undertrained conscripts exhausted from previous battles. The high command in Chongqing, realizing Jinling couldn't be held, had already begun retreating in secret. The stage was set for a massacre cloaked in military conquest. The Japanese approached Jinling from 3 directions, squeezing the city like a vice. As the outer defenses crumbled under artillery and aerial bombardment, civilians poured into the city walls, believing they would be protected there. But the walls would not hold. On December 9th, General Hisamori offered surrender terms through loudspeakers and leaflets, promising safety to those who laid down their arms. It was a ruse. 2 days later, on December 11th, Japanese infantry stormed the city. What followed remains one of the most horrifying episodes of the 20th century. The assault wasn't merely strategic. It was personal, fanatical, and unrestrained. Japanese soldiers flooded into the city like water through shattered glass, firing indiscriminately, tossing grenades into basements, setting fire to homes still occupied by families. The official military objective had been met within 48 hours, but the killing didn't stop. Jinling descended into madness. Groups of surrendered Chinese soldiers, often stripped of their weapons and kneeling with hands above their heads, were led to riverbanks, open fields, and alleyways, then machine-gunned en masse. Some were used for bayonet practice. Others were tied to stakes and burned alive. Civilians fared no better. The Japanese military adhered to a twisted belief that all Chinese men were potential combatants and all Chinese women were spoils of war. Entire households were slaughtered after the women were repeatedly assaulted. One Chinese woman, only 14 years old, was reportedly stabbed after resisting assault and left to die in a gutter, her body discovered days later by international volunteers. Worse still was the brutality carried out with open pride. 2 officers, Second Lieutenants Takeo Muraoka and Shinjiro Noda, were celebrated in Japanese newspapers for competing in a macabre contest who could behead 100 prisoners first, using only their swords. Updates were published daily, as if tallying baseball scores. When the 2 surpassed 100 each, they agreed to continue until a clear winner emerged. These were not rumors whispered in fear. They were facts printed in Tokyo's morning editions, broadcast to a nation drunk on conquest. Foreign nationals remaining in Jinling, particularly missionaries, journalists, and doctors, took refuge in a small area on the western edge of the city that had been designated as a safety zone. German businessman Hans Reiter, an unlikely protector with no Nazi affiliations, led efforts to shelter tens of thousands of civilians. The Japanese command initially agreed to avoid entering this zone, but as days passed and discipline eroded, troops began slipping in at night. Women were dragged away, children beaten, and men executed in the streets outside the gates. Even the Red Cross symbols painted on the walls couldn't deter the violence. By the end of December, more than 200,000 civilians and surrendered soldiers were dead. Survivors told stories that read like horror fiction: infants thrown into the air and skewered on bayonets, elderly men forced to dig their own graves, families burned alive inside their homes. Reverend Samuel Gant, an American missionary stationed at the Jinling Seminary, wrote in his journal, "This is not war. This is not strategy. This is evil raw and unfiltered." A doctor from the university hospital noted that rape victims ranged in age from 7 to 70, and that many were mutilated or murdered afterward. One night, Japanese soldiers broke into a refugee shelter and carried off over 30 women. None returned. The fall of Jinling wasn't just a military victory, it was a descent into moral annihilation. The city, once the cultural and political soul of China, had become a graveyard of ash and blood. And yet, for Japan's high command, it was celebrated as a triumph. Parades were held in Tokyo. Medals were distributed. The truth buried beneath layers of silence and denial would take years to claw its way back into the light. But for the people of Jinling, there was no forgetting. No forgiving. Only the long-haunted memory of what happens when ambition devours humanity and no one dares say, stop. What happened in Jinling after its military collapse wasn't a post-battle mop-up operation. It was an industrialized descent into horror, orchestrated by an occupying force that no longer saw its victims as human beings. Following the slaughter of surrendered soldiers and the brutalization of civilians during the initial invasion, the Japanese army didn't relent. Instead, they formalized their violence, systematized it, and unleashed it on a defenseless population at a scale so vast it defied belief. What had begun as battlefield fury metastasized into something colder, an organized campaign of mass murder, sexual violence, and psychological destruction. Within days of entering the city, Japanese forces established processing zones for Chinese prisoners, makeshift camps guarded by machine guns and encircled with barbed wire. One such facility near the village of Mufan housed over 20,000 captured soldiers and civilian men. They were told they would be transferred or interrogated. Instead, at sunrise, heavy machine guns opened fire as the men rose to their feet. Witnesses described prisoners falling like dominoes as bullets tore through rows of bodies. In the chaos, some tried to escape climbing over the wire or using corpses as makeshift ladders. Those who made it to the edges were cut down by bayonets or chased and shot as they fled. By midday, the entire camp had been emptied, its inhabitants either dead or drowned after being tossed into the icy waters of the Longjiang River. The shoreline turned red. These were not isolated acts of cruelty. They were part of a growing pattern, a method. Japanese soldiers were trained to believe Chinese lives held no value, and under the doctrine of Kokutai, which emphasized complete loyalty to the emperor and nation. Mercy was viewed as weakness. Reports emerged of prisoners being tied to poles for live bayonet training, their screams drowned by laughter. Some were doused in kerosene and burned alive. Others had their heads displayed on pikes outside military encampments. The brutality became ritualized, almost performative, as if cruelty itself had become a marker of loyalty and strength. For women, the nightmare was worse. Tens of thousands of Chinese women, some as young as 8, others well into their 70s, were raped by Japanese troops. Many were assaulted in front of family members or herded into homes that were then set ablaze. Survivors were rare, and those who lived carried physical and emotional scars that would last a lifetime. Testimonies collected by international aid workers detail rape victims mutilated with bayonets, breasts and genitals, slashed open faces, carved with knives. The scale of sexual violence was so extreme that even hardened war correspondents broke down. Reverend Samuel Gant wrote in his diary, "There are no words left in me. I am a witness to something far beyond sin." Even the so-called safety zone, established by foreign nationals and marked with Red Cross banners, was not spared. At its peak, the zone sheltered over 100,000 refugees, mostly women and children. Though Japanese commanders initially agreed to honor its boundaries, discipline among the soldiers quickly disintegrated. Night raids became routine. Women were dragged away by the dozens, often never to return. German businessman Hans Reiter and American missionary Clara Mitchell, who coordinated efforts within the zone, recorded over 450 incidents of abduction, assault, or execution within the supposed sanctuary. They sent letters to the Japanese embassy. They received no reply. International observers documented what they could. Doctors, teachers, and volunteers filled notebooks with handwritten case reports, trying desperately to preserve the truth. One report described 7 girls, aged 16 to 21, taken by force. 5 returned days later, each violated multiple times a day. Another listed the killing of a 14-year-old girl by bayonet after she screamed during an attempted assault. In the university hospital's refugee camp, a little boy only 8 years old was stabbed 5 times and left to die. His name was never recorded. By the end of January 1938, Jinling was not just occupied, it was hollowed out. The dead numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The city's soul had been flayed open, its people brutalized, and its streets buried under silence and ash. The world, for the most part, remained mute, and for those who lived through it, there would never be a full return to life as before, only the ache of survival and the memory of what humanity looks like when it loses all sense of itself. By the time the fires of Jinling had cooled and the last screams faded into silence, a haunting question lingered in the ashes. Who would be held accountable? The Japanese army had committed atrocities on a scale so vast, so systematic, that they could not be written off as the work of a few rogue units. These weren't crimes of war, they were war as crime. And yet, in the immediate aftermath, the machinery of justice stalled. Japan's high command spun the massacre as a military necessity, downplaying the reports or blaming rogue officers for excesses. Back in Tokyo, parades were held, medals were awarded, and the world, still grappling with its own political chaos, looked away. Inside Japan, public discussion of Jinling was virtually non-existent. The few military leaders who expressed remorse, such as General Yutaro Hisamori, were quietly retired or removed from the spotlight. Hisamori himself, reportedly stricken with guilt, told a civilian aide, "What we have done cannot be undone, and it must never be repeated." But his words fell on deaf ears. The emperor, the generals, the press all seemed more interested in preserving the illusion of national glory than in confronting the truth. That silence began to fracture only after World War II ended in 1985, when Japan's unconditional surrender forced open the doors of accountability. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, sometimes called the Tokyo Trials, was convened by the Allies to prosecute major Japanese war criminals. Among the accused was General Hisamori, indicted for failing to prevent or punish the atrocities at Jinling. During his trial, he claimed he had issued orders to maintain discipline and had been unaware of the full extent of the crimes committed by his men. But eyewitness testimony, captured documents, and photographic evidence painted a damning picture.